technical difficulties over here, but I'm going to dive right in because I have quite a bit to cover. So thank you for joining. Welcome to my talk, Sniffing Out Cert Abuse, a Dogged Approach to ESC Remediation. Apologies for the terrible bloodhound pun. There is no more in this presentation, but I'm going to cover different ways to kind of audit and remediate different ESC attack paths, so escalation paths, from 1 all the way through to 16, which was actually released earlier this year, back in May. So I'm going to cover some prioritization methodology as well that I built out recently for identifying ESC kind of attack paths, all of these different escalations in your environment specifically. All right, so I'm going to start with just a quick intro, followed by an ADCS overview for anybody who's not familiar with these attack paths. Then I'll dive into remediation for a select subset of these techniques. I don't have time to go into all of them today. And then I'll go through the prioritization matrix walkthrough and some future research opportunities. All right, so quick intro. My name's Emily Leidy. I'm a managing consultant here at SpecterOps. I've been with the company for about 4.5 years now. So I started back in 2021 as a defensive consultant, kind of worked my way up. So now I manage a team of offensive, defensive operators. It really runs the gamut. But I also kind of lead assessments myself, so I'm kind of operational as well, but more focused on building out services at this point. I'm based here in New York, so I'm excited. Hopefully, some of you didn't have to travel too far, but definitely love, attending shows here, all that stuff. I was a professional opera singer in a former life, so that's what I like to do in my free time. All right, so I'm going to start with some ADCS background. So by a show of hands, who's heard of ADCS escalation paths? Okay, awesome, a fair few. So I'm sure you're familiar with certified pre-owned as well. So ADCS, for those of you that did not raise your hand, just stands for Active Directory Certificate Services. So it's a Windows Server role for issuing and managing PKI, public key infrastructure. All of these certs, they're used in secure communication, different authentication protocols as well. So the screenshot on the right shows a set of COM kind of interfaces, objects, allows us to view and manage our environment as well in our Active Directory forest. So you can see public key services. That container holds this forest-wide configuration for ADCS itself. So it's really your one-stop shop, your way to manage your environment. So my colleagues, Will Schroeder and Lee Shagola Christensen, they released Certified Pre-Owned, made a lot of waves in the industry back in 2021. So that kind of seminal research that they did covered escalations 1 through 8. So that was really the basis of ADCS, of all of these escalation opportunities and misconfigurations that they identified. So since then, in the last roughly 4 years, 8 more have actually been added. So ESC 9 all the way through ESC 16, most recently, which was released back in May of this year. So I wanted to give a quick shout out to my colleague Jonas as well. He did a lot of this research on remediation last year, so this kind of builds on some of his research from that talk. All right, so I'm going to go into ADCS components really fast. These are some kind of relevant LDAP objects for modeling ADCS attack paths, which sit in this configuration naming context. So on the left, we have our certificate template node. That has this non-traversable publish to edge. So this represents the AD objects of that PKI certificate template LDAP class. So the enterprise CA in the center, that stores your permissions and registry on the computer hosting that enterprise CA service. So when you're authenticating in AD using some certificate, the DC then checks and see if it trusts that certificate or the issuer of the cert for NT authentication. So all of that is kind of stored in this NT auth store. And that is what's kind of holding all of those certificates trusted for NT authentication. And those are held in its CA certificate attribute. So for ESC1, really all of these escalation paths, there's a series of conditions that need to be met for it to be viable. So ESC1, using that as our example, the enterprise CA really has to be trusted for NT authentication for that to work. All right. So all of these map back to that initial set of kind of COM interfaces. So you see public key services, this container that we saw on the first slide. They all have their own subcontainers as well. So on each of these objects, Bloodhound collects the security descriptor and the relevant ACEs of the DACL, the discretionary access control list, of each of these security descriptors. So on an enterprise CA object, where the enrollment rates and those replicated kind of rights, they're replicated from the host essentially up into the LDAP object. So from that, we can see which principals are actually allowed to enroll, which have full control of the CA, things like that. And I'm going to mention Bloodhound throughout this. How many of you are familiar with Bloodhound, that tool? Okay, most of you? Great. I'm wearing the shirt, so got a rep. But Bloodhound is a great tool. I'm going to mention it. I'm not talking about our enterprise product. We do have a paid product, but we also have a community edition version. So all of this is applicable to our community edition. So that's open source. All right, so since my colleague Jonas's talk last year, there have been a number of updates to ADCS. So starting with ADCS ESC 9, specifically attack paths or edges A and B, it's no longer tenable. There was a recent Windows patch in September, on September 9th. It enforces this strong certificate mapping. So it's really no longer viable, so we have since removed it. And I've kind of nixed it from this presentation. Same with ESC 14, specifically scenarios B, C, and D, as well as ESC 15. So there are still some escalations, some scenarios in ESC 14 that are viable. So you can map alt security identities with a strong value such as cert thumbprint. So that does still work. So you should still see that if you're mapping out a full environment. And then ESC 16 was recently added. We have not since mapped this or pushed it to Bloodhound, so you won't see that just yet. You can't use Bloodhound, unfortunately, to audit this, but it is coming. And then we can now identify ESC 8 in Bloodhound with this new edge that we've added recently. It's coerce and relay NTLM to ADCS. So if you just search, kind of run a Cypher query and then find that edge, then you'll know, if ESC 8 is prevalent in your environment. And then finally, Bloodhound now has the ability to show all of these ADCS kind of inbound escalation opportunities for a singular domain, which is awesome, really allows you to kind of see everything that is applicable to a specific domain in your environment, anything that you're really concerned about. You can more easily find some of these edges that completely cut off the most non-tier 0 nodes, which is what we're concerned with. All right, so I'm going to start with some of the basics and kind of the requirements for ESC 1. I'm using that as our example today. So a subject alternative name, it's a SAN. It's just an extension that allows for some additional identities to be bound to a certificate beyond just the subject of the cert. So if a web server hosts content for multiple domains, each of those domains could be included in the SAN so that the web server only needs a single HTTPS cert instead of one for each domain. It's really convenient, but it does allow for some dangerous situations regarding domain authentication. Using ESC1 as kind of our first example, if an attacker can specify an arbitrary SAN when they're requesting some certificate that enables domain authentication, and the CA creates and signs a certificate using that attacker-supplied SAN, the attacker can become essentially any user in the domain. So very, very powerful. And we see this, unfortunately, in a lot of client environments. A lot of customers do have this. So I actually ran a Cypher query across our entire BHE fleet. So that was roughly 1,500 actually domains. So quite a few. And ESC1 was the second highest attack path that I found after ESC4. So there's a series of conditions, like I mentioned, that need to be met for this to actually be possible. But it does permit this low privileged user to request a certificate, specify that arbitrary identity within the certificate SAN, and then kind of allows them to impersonate any user, including admins. So that does require one of these conditions that I mentioned, requires this enrollee supplies subject flag to be enabled. All right, so escalation 1, it's just this abuse primitive, very common. I've kind of reviewed the basics of it already. So I'm just going to walk through what it would actually look like. And we're going to use Alice and Bob as our examples. And I'm not going to get into enrollment agent restrictions here. There's really ultimately no protection against this. It's just as powerful as like DC sync. But let's say we have our cert template, we have our enterprise CA, we have our DC, and we're assuming that Alice has the ability to do ESC1. So the way Alice would actually do this, she requests this enterprise CA to issue a certificate back that's valid for authentication, where a particular field in the certificate called subject alternative name, so our SAN, will be populated by the user principal name of some other user, in our case Bob. So let's say Bob is domain admin. So we can say our SAN is bob@contoso.local. The security reference monitor on the host that hosts that CA service will then check several different security descriptors and see if Alice can actually do that. So they say, yep, Alice can. So the CA then issues this certificate back that's valid for authentication. And that certificate needs to have some sort of EKU that's valid for NT authentication. There's several. In our case, we're just using client authentication. So with that certificate, Alice can then present that to the domain, the DC, just say, hey, I want a TGT as Bob. So this certificate serves as the credential. It's really our proof that we're allowed to authenticate as Bob. So at this point, the domain controller will then return your TGT that can then be used to get different TGSs, and Alice has effectively become Bob. So, she is impersonating him in the domain at this point. This is extremely common, a very reliable privilege escalation primitive. It's common in nearly, every AD environment. Finding it by hand can be time consuming, so that's why Bloodhound is so effective. So escalation 1 is really possible because of the mechanics of the system. You have the security descriptors on your different objects, and then configurations on these different objects. So there's at least 5 objects that have to be present for this to be possible, for it to emerge. There's actually a composition graph that we have in Bloodhound that allows you to view all of these, but all of these puzzle pieces essentially fit together to create this primitive. So if we remove one of these puzzle pieces, one of these configurations, like what if CA is not issued by root CA? It won't be trusted by the domain, so ESC1 is null and void. So I'm going to start grouping some of these different escalation techniques into abuse categories. This will allow us to kind of prioritize our remediation if there are any through lines in your environment. So for ESC1, ESC1, ESC2, ESC3, and 13, they all have to do with this template that enables impersonation. ESC4, 5, 7, and 12 all require control over ADCS objects. So you can kind of see some of these commonalities between all of these escalation attacks. And for this chart, I've just bolded the ones that I'll try to walk through today. Hopefully we'll have enough time for all of them. And then I'm not going to dive into what each of these escalation paths is. There's plenty of resources out there, so if you're interested, I'm happy to share this. So remediation guidance is very difficult to build, right? You have like 10 or 12 different conditions that need to be met. So if you're looking for the factor of all of those different combinations, you're going to have like 40 or 50. So that makes it very daunting for a lot of customers to know where to start. Maybe you have like generic rate on the object and roll rates through another path, or you have generic all on like a services container, but that only inherits down to a certain class of objects, and you have another way to make up for it somewhere else. So this is very environment dependent, and it's going to change kind of your priority level for each of these escalation paths. So we hear this from a lot of customers. We don't need to audit ADCS because we have preventative tooling in place, or we've done regular testing. Or they've already remediated, back in like 2021. But like we've seen, there have been a lot of new escalations that have been discovered just in the last few years. So I'm going to go through these. I would definitely recommend auditing ADCS. A lack of visibility really leaves you blind to a lot of these pretty critical attack paths that we exploit regularly in penetration tests and red teams. These are extremely common and viable. And there's a lot of great mitigation guidance on the Certipy wiki as well. If you're familiar with that, definitely check it out. So I'll start with ESC 1 and 13. So this first bucket, which is template enables impersonation. So you have this Cypher query down below. If you're not familiar with Cypher queries, there's a lot of great documentation on our Bloodhound pages, but we're essentially looking for anything ESC 1, ESC 13, so self-explanatory, but we're looking for anything that's not sourced by admin tier 0. So we're looking for anything that's not this admin tier 0, which should have those privileges anyway. And then we're returning this path object P, so the source node, relationship, target node. So if you can, for remediation, limit enrollment rights to tier 0 principals. You want to remove any EKUs that enable domain authentication, so you can only impersonate for signing and things like that, which aren't quite as bad as authenticating. And this applies to ESC 2 and 3 too. They're in that same abuse category, but say you have like a group help desk, so they're not tier 0, but they do need these impersonation rights if they're, say, creating smart cards for other users and things like that. So the kind of workaround, the solution to this would be implementing enrollment agents with restrictions. So this allows you to specify more granular permissions for enrollment agents and kind of who they can impersonate. I would deny the impersonation for tier 0 admins, but there's a lot of good vendor guides for this. There's also a lot of not so good ones, so proceed with caution, but Ubico has a really great one out there, so I'm happy to send that link if you're interested. All right. So to audit ESC4 in your environment, you can run this Cypher query too. I'm going to run through this because we are short on time. But the primary remediation for this is to restrict control over your ADCS objects, especially for your non-tier 0 principals. So this includes control over CA computers. You want to enumerate all of these security principals that have non-default rights. So you're looking for your generic all, your write DACL, your managed CA, things like that. And then enforce group policy to block non-admin certificate enrollment modifications. This applies to ESC 5, 7, and 12 as well. There's some great event IDs too that you can enable if you're centralizing your telemetry and like a SIM. There's event ID 4899. You have to do some group policy modifications probably, but 4900 for CA configuration changes, 4662, things like that. All right, and then this is the latest coerce and relay NTLM to ADCS. So this will allow you to detect ESC 8. So the remediation for this, if it does, show up in your environment, it's kind of twofold. So you want to enable extended protection for authentication. This is really the primary mitigation for IIS-hosted web services like Cert SRV. You want to configure this application protocol or pool, kind of site hosting the ADCS web services to require EPA. So just set that to required. And then for requiring HTTPS, you want to ensure all of your ADCS web services are configured to use HTTPS only. So disable HTTP bindings, but this isn't going to in of itself prevent NTLM relay, but it is a prereq for EPA. All right, and then a lot of the more recent escalations, they have some overlap with pre-existing ones. So ESC 16 overlaps a good deal with ESC 9. They both deal with DC's strong certificate binding enforcement setting. But there's a few key indicators. Like I mentioned, we're not ingesting this into Bloodhound just yet, but you can audit it with Certify. So I'm not going to go into all of those indicators, but there's some good information on the wiki. And then for remediation, this is going to include re-enabling the SID security extension on the CA. You can do that using Cert util and making sure it's patched properly. You'll also want to enable full strong certificate binding enforcement on DCs. And then this is coming soon to Bloodhound, so just an FYI. We are going to be adding ESC 14 at scenario A. So ultimately, proceed with caution. Remediation is a balance. You don't want to just, click and then people are screaming in the background. Not great. You want to look at all of your dependencies in place. Kind of document where you can. Look at anything that, could happen, could break as part of remediation, because that does happen. All right, so I'm going to go into prioritization. Like I mentioned, this is a new view that we've added to Bloodhound. It allows you to view all of these inbound ADCS paths in your environment in a given domain. So it's a great starting point when you're looking at what to start remediating. What's the most critical? What is mapping to non-tier 0 users? All right, so prioritizing remediation, it's tough, like I mentioned. And we've thought about this a lot internally of how to incorporate it into Bloodhound itself. But path length is not currently factored into our exposure score. So even if you remove some of your shortest paths, the impact, the risk is not really clear, that risk reduction, just because longer alternative paths might exist in the environment. So there's different ways of doing this. You could do like a Monte Carlo simulation, kind of using repeated random sampling, using starting nodes, kind of crawl the graph that way. But in the meantime, while we build that out internally, I have developed this priority score formula to help users get started. So I gave impact and exploitability the largest weights because of the significant effects of ADCS. Misconfigurations can have, you can have forest-wide compromise. And then likelihood is weighted next because a lot of environments do expose these conditions. Like I mentioned, I ran Cypher queries across our fleet, and ESC1 and ESC4, ESC8, those were 3 of the most common. So this is all, and I'm going to pull up an example here in a sec, but these are all based on real-world environments that we're currently monitoring. All right, so one quick note on detection difficulty, that is weighted the lowest. It's not non-zero, just because detection difficulty, it's a little bit different. It's usually treated as its own entity or capability, but if a detection is harder to build, say for like ESC4, then that might bump up your remediation score a little bit in that priority. So this is the matrix that I built out. It's geared toward all of these viable escalation techniques. The ultimate goal here is to help you calculate a priority score based on a number of different values. So like I mentioned, a lot of these are based on actual environments. You can tailor these to your environment though. So I kind of assumed a moderate maturity for defensive and offensive operations and functions. But say you don't have a detection function, or your detection team is made of 1 and they're pretty junior. Then you might bump the detection difficulty scores up to high, critical, something like that. All right. So I'm going to touch on some attack path research opportunities too. These are either things that we're already looking into internally or just things that I would love to dig into if I had a little bit more time. But There's a lot of great work out there, good research on detections for ADCS attack paths. So I've included 2 links here. We've actually done a lot of work with the Australian Signals Directorate. They're great. They put out good research pretty regularly. So there's also remediation automation. So one of our security researchers, JD, or SAD processor, if you're familiar with his handle, he's working on some remediation automation scripts as part of his BH operator PowerShell client. These are meant to be like click-to-fix playbooks for common attack paths. And this would also calculate your shortest path to DA to help you prioritize findings for your environment. And it feels like there's a new Open Graph extension every week. I think that's going to keep coming. There's a ton of opportunity here. So you could even, prioritize or pull in some of your prioritization calculations from that previous matrix that I pulled up as Open Graph attributes on templates, CAs, and surface a priority score in Bloodhound. There's just so many things that you can do with it. So that is a great research area that I think folks are going to continue digging into. And then finally, MCP integration. Matthew Nickerson, who's one of my colleagues, he's done a lot of research on this. He's actually here at the conference. So if you run into him, say hi. But this would be a great way to kind of ask Bloodhound some questions as you're remediating. So if you don't know what the downstream consequences of some remediation step could be, MCP comes in handy for sure. All right, that is all I have for today. I know that was really fast, but thank you so much.